31-minute side east of the merge, Bishop 435. Southbound Lakeshore Drive is jammed Lawrence to North Avenue, northbound from the Stevenson to Jackson. Northbound Tri-State delays are in pockets 95th to 47th. At Roosevelt to North Avenue, it's about Reagan-Silver delays, 31 to Yackley and 83 to the Tri-State. I'm Jim Telemonkey on AM 560 The Answer.
Chicago's Morning Answer continues next in our 1 hour heating and air conditioning weather center. Chilly day ahead. Clouds and sun mixed. Chance, about a 10% chance of a shower this afternoon. High near 50, brisk and colder overnight, low of 30. It's 45 right now. Next news at 9. Chicago's Morning Answer with Dan and Amy continues next on AM 560 The Answer.
This hourly segment is brought to you by Retire Chicago. Tune in Saturday mornings at 8 to Retire Chicago with John McNamara of McNamara Capital.
This is Chicago's Morning Answer.
Have you ever smoked?
I have.
Okay.
And I inhale. I did inhale.
On AM 560.
I think that it gives a lot of people joy, and we need more joy.
Yeah.
When is she going to drop out of the race?
Those are happier times for Reparation H. She is circling the drain in Iowa. She doesn't even get parodied on that Saturday Night Live anymore. Just her campaign staffers do.
Right.
All right. I didn't, sometimes you forget. I guess you get inside your own bubble a bit, and you forget questions like the one posed by our next guest and author are actually questions. They're not settled in the minds of many. This question, did America have a Christian founding? Not settled in the minds of many, particularly as I guess our country becomes more secular and you have young people more inclined to embrace socialism, even communism, according to some recent surveys, all disturbing stuff. Mark David Hall, Herbert Hoover's Distinguished Professor of Politics and Faculty Fellow in the William Penn Honors Program at George Fox University. He is the author of the new book, Did America Have a Christian Founding? And he joins us now. Mark, thanks so much for being with us. Appreciate it.
Hey, thanks so much for having me, Dan.
So, this the idea that America, or the question as to whether America did or did not have a Christian founding, this is in controversy?
Absolutely it is. I take issue at what might even be called a scholarly consensus. Academic after academic, popular author after popular author writes books saying things like most of America's founders were deists. They created a godless constitution, and they built a wall of separation between church and state. In the book, I sort of line up all these myths, by which I mean a false story, and I'd like to think I demolish them. There's just very little historical evidence to support these widespread claims.
And since we had no less an authority than House Majority Whip James Clyburn invoking Thomas Paine over the weekend, some of the founding fathers and who authored our founding documents, their writings and musings and influences suggest what?
Well, that's a great question. It's a nice way to set it up, too, because one of the errors these scholars make is they routinely turn to founders like Thomas Paine. And I'd be the first to admit Thomas Paine is not an Orthodox Christian.
Right.
He's the closest thing among American civic leaders to a deist, with the exception of Ethan Allen. But he's really not an American. He's born in England. He spends most of his life over in Europe. He comes over to America and he writes a few important works like Common Sense, very important, but he doesn't help write the Declaration or Constitution or Bill of Rights. He returns to England or to Europe and writes Age of Reason, which is an explicitly deistic work. When he comes back to America, he's vilified because of it. No one wants to have anything to do with them. When he dies, not even the tolerant Quakers allow him to be buried in a churchyard. So he has to be buried in a farm with like 6 mourners. And so Paine is important. I'm not denying he's important, but he's very unrepresentative. A few other founders, Franklin, Jefferson, and Adams, are not Orthodox Christians either, although those three seem to believe in a providential God, a God that intervenes in history, and so they're not deists. But when you turn to the vast majority of civic leaders, I'm not talking about farmers out in the field having nothing to do with politics, but the sort of men in the Continental Congress that are approving the Declaration of Independence, the men in the federal conventions, the men in the state ratifying conventions and state legislatures. There's a great deal of evidence that they were influenced by their Christian convictions in very important ways.
The academic rewriting of American history, which, by the way, now is getting to the area of rewriting when our country was founded altogether, much less the basis on which it was founded. I mean, the 1619 Project suggests that's the real founding of America, right? So the rewriting of American history, the redefinition of American history, if you will, by these academics, it's purposeful, isn't it? It's the to undermine the idea that America was founded on Judeo-Christian values is to undermine the sense that America has any moral authority, or that there is anybody has any moral authority, right? We're in the era of the famous inscription that Rusty Reno always references in the 60s in Paris. It is forbidden to forbid. That's where academics want America to be.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. So a lot of the scholarship I'm talking about is scholarship from the mid-20th century, and it continues to the present day. And I think to the extent to which there's an ideological motivation, they want to argue that America had this wonderful Enlightenment founding. The founders were rationalists, and they wanted these sorts of outcomes I mentioned before. The 1619 Project takes it a step further to say basically America is founded in this grave evil of slavery, and pretty much nothing redeems it from that. And so we have to atone for it. Now, I would be the first to admit that slavery is a grave moral evil,
Sure.
But I would also argue that it's precisely because of their Christian convictions that some founders were starting to question this, that something like 8 states voluntarily abolished slavery between 1776 and 1808. And, of course, when the abolitionist movement gets up and running in the 19th century, this is a profoundly Christian movement. And so thank goodness America was founded founded by Christians. It had a Christian founding, and I think this eventually led to the elimination of slavery. I wish, as a bloody Civil War, hadn't been necessary to bring this about, and I'm not sure it was absolutely necessary, but of course, as history played out, that's what happened. But you're right, there is an ideological agenda behind this. There are also some more practical agendas, if you'd like to talk about that later.
And the practical agenda behind your book, is it at least in part to sort of reconnect more Americans to their founding for the purposes of, I don't know, sort of resuscitating values that were informed the founding?
You know, that would be a wonderful outcome. America's founders were absolutely convinced that religion is necessary for morality, and morality is necessary if we were to be a republic. And they were convinced of that to a person. And by religion, they meant Christianity. And so I certainly would pray for revival in that respect. But frankly, I'm happy to make common cause with my with Christians of all stripes, and with a clear agenda. The U.S. Supreme Court in 1947 in Everson versus the Board of Education said we must interpret the First Amendment in light of the founders' views. Thomas Jefferson and James Madison equal the American founders. It's been used to deny tax-exempt status to churches, to say we can't fund private religious schools on the same terms as other private schools, that we can't grant religious accommodations to protect minorities from being drafted and this sort of thing. It's a very pernicious doctrine, and it's a doctrine that has absolutely no foundation in the American founding.
Well, you wrote an article about how old does a monument need to be in lawliberty.org, and putting a cross in a public space, is that protected by free speech?
I would say there's absolutely no constitutional violation if a town or locality desires to do so. The case you're referencing, of course, or I believe you are, is the case coming out of Maryland that the Supreme Court just decided. In this case, it was a World War I era cross. It was actually initially put on private land with private dollars. It's a mammoth cross to memorialize the dead from this county, the dead men from this county in World War I. Eventually, the state had to take it over, and so it's now on public property and maintained by public funds. And the American Humanist Association said this cannot stand. We must destroy this cross or decapitate it or do something with it. It's a violation of the wall of separation between church and state. So as I read the Establishment Clause, and I'm really quite sure I'm right about this, there's absolutely no constitutional violation. Now, the U.S. Supreme Court agreed with this position 7-2, and so the separationists need a fallback position. And so what they've said is, well, maybe old monuments are okay, but new monuments are. So if a town puts up a memorial, say in the 21st century, that has a religious symbol, that could be torn down, or that must be destroyed. And what I argue in my little essay is the problem with this is many of the more recent memorials actually have non-Christian symbols. So I reference, for instance, Ohio's Holocaust Memorial, which features fairly prominently the Star of David. So the Freedom from Religion Foundation, just like the American Humanist Association, said this is impermissible. You can't have the Star of David in a Holocaust memorial, to which I say this is utterly ridiculous. Of course you can. It's a matter of the Establishment Clause. And, of course, we're talking about memorials on public land. If it was on private land, anything goes. So what we're really concerned about here is when a state or locality decides to create some sort of memorial with some sort of religious inscription or symbol. And I argue that it's absolutely constitutional as a matter of the Establishment Clause for localities or the national government, for that matter, to do this sort of thing.
Well, the Freedom from Religion Foundation has the perfect name because in its name it incorporates the entire movement's complete misunderstanding of the First Amendment and the Establishment Clause. It was never, there's no language about separation of church and state. The Establishment Clause is the state shall not establish a national religion, and so that's the test that needs to be applied to these questions about religiosity in the public space. Isn't that right?
That's exactly right. So, and you know, I fleshed this out a bit in the book, as you might imagine. But simply put, the First Amendment says Congress shall make no law respecting the establishment of religion. This means at least we aren't going to have a national church. The Establishment Clause has since been applied to the states, and so now Illinois can't create a state church either. But other than that, almost anything goes. Governors can issue calls for prayer and fasting or give Thanksgiving Day proclamations. Illinois, if it wanted to, could choose to provide vouchers so that parents could send their children to religious schools. They would need to be neutral, I contend. So if you wouldn't want to just fund Catholic schools, right? You want to provide vouchers so parents could send their kids to a Jewish school or a Protestant school or a Catholic school or whatever. But perfectly constitutional. So let's just get away from this bad history and debate the merits of calls for prayer and fasting or vouchers or memorials. Let's debate them on their merits, and let's have real arguments about it instead of pretending that America's founders prohibited those sorts of things.
He is Mark David Hall, the Herbert Hoover Distinguished Professor of Politics, faculty fellow in the William Penn Honors Program at George Fox University. The book, Did America Have a Christian Founding? Mark David Hall, thanks for joining us. Appreciate it.
Hey, thanks very much for having me.
And he joined us on our turnkey.pro answer line.
The stories you need to know to start your day. This is Chicago's Morning Answer on AM 560. The Answer.
Balance of Nature's fruit and veggie